right, Nick, thank you so much for being a guest on the Holistic Hub podcast. I'm super excited to interview you today regarding EMFs, talking about your book, and as well as helping to just promote and give this information out there because the EMF Summit is about to launch in the next week or so.
For sure. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Awesome. Well, like I love to ask any expert when they come on the podcast, just what occurred in your life that led you to wanting to go down the rabbit hole of EMFs? Because there's not many people that really are diving as deep into it as you are, which is so appreciative that you are doing this and giving us this valuable information. So what kind of was occurring along your journey that led you to all of this?
Yeah, I'm almost laughing internally because I'm like, why am I doing this? Why have I been doing this for 8 years at this point? And it's true that most people don't look at the EMF so deeply. So I don't know, I started as a citizen journalist looking into environmental toxins around 2009. At the time, I didn't know what to eat. I knew very little in terms of holistic health principles. I injured myself every other week doing bodybuilding. So, I was getting into my health journey in one way that was slightly destructive to my body. But then I realized that, it's not only the foods that you choose, but also what's been sprayed on the food that you choose. So I realized, wait a minute, there's pesticide residues on non-organic stuff. Okay, that's concerning. And what about this protein powder that I bought? I realized that the market was, it was supposed to be regulated, and yet you had independent organizations like Consumer Reports that were fighting heavy metals like lead and arsenic and cadmium in protein powders. I was looking at my jug of protein and saying, my God, well, what is it doing to my body, over time? And I have this every single day. So it made me really think about the widespread contamination on our food supply. But then, one rabbit hole after another, I discovered, wait a minute, they say that now that tap water could contain heavy metals. So how come, right? How come no one ever taught me that back in the time I was living in Montreal. I'm still am at the moment, and we have a huge problem of lead contamination, just like many U.S. cities. But the most dramatic and, let's say, media frenzy experience was in Flint, Michigan, several years ago, where it was a real scandal because health officials kind of downplayed the risk. But here, according to my findings almost 15 years ago, the city of Montreal is still downplaying the risks of how much contamination there is. So that's my background. I spent 6 to 7 years in that direction, all sorts of environmental toxins. I was already on the path to doing this work, but I didn't know that EMF was such a big problem. I did not understand that when you have the radiation emitted by your smartphone and Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, my first thought was, well, of course it's regulated. Of course someone looked into health and made sure that we are not impacted by these everyday devices because, of course, throughout the years, they installed cell towers and we have more and more modern phones. And for sure, we have someone that is spearheading research and making sure that everything is safe. But then I also thought, well, they kind of got it wrong with tap water and they got it wrong with so many things. So why should I trust regulators on EMFs? And I started reading one book after another and really realized it's bad. It's bad. It's just as bad as many other environmental toxins where the safety studies are not properly done. There's industry capture of the regulators that are supposed to regulate the industry. So in other words, people at the Federal Communication Commission, FCC in the USA, or even Health Canada or other organizations at the international level are people from the industry. So in the end, the regulators are more like a front group for the industry, and they are really in a blatant conflict of interest because at the same time that they sell spectrum, and spectrum is these informational highway, if you will, certain frequencies that different operators like AT&T and Verizon are allowed to emit from their cell towers, for example. So that's the FCC is responsible for selling them spectrum. And at the same time, so they make money the more that the cell towers are rolled out, the more the government makes money. And you're telling me at the same time the FCC is supposed to tell these industries, no, stop doing it because of health issues. It's kind of bizarre that you have these two roles that are kind of opposite. So I realized that, wait a minute, if our safety regulations are not ironclad here for EMFs, does it mean that we are in trouble? And the answer was likely yes, because of course it was not only that the safety standards were insufficient, but also we had early warnings in the science to the effect that EMFs might be linked with cancer. That was one of the first topics that was, let's say, talked about in the media, even back in the 80s and 90s, in people, mostly business people at the time, that have a heavy use of these big bricks, the Nokia 9000 phones or other models like this. And some people were claiming, well, I got a brain tumor, or I got a parotid gland tumor, or thyroid tumor, or glioblastoma, which kills most people that develop these sort of tumors. And acoustic neuroma also was a problem, which is a non-cancerous tumor, although it can lead to death, or it can also lead to hearing loss. So a lot of people were claiming that, but it was not only that. It was the science around EMFs and fertility, EMFs and pregnancy, and the impacts on future children. It was so many lines of evidence that each time they led to results that were inconvenient to industry, these lines of research disappeared, or the scientists abandoned research, or got systematically defunded. So basically, at this point in 2016, I concluded for myself, this is the most underappreciated type of environmental toxin out of all of them. And not only that, instead of heeding the early warnings, we are rolling out more technologies, stronger signals, and multiplying the problem by manyfold every couple of years. So I said, this is the fastest growing category of environmental toxins, even though we have the early warnings. And then there's another dimension that made me stay on this topic, is that you can more easily avoid certain environmental toxins like pesticides. You could say, well, instead of pesticides, we're going to use natural substances to protect our crops, and there are alternatives. But now we're talking about the technology that everyone uses, including the leaders in holistic health. So it is something that is so part of life right now that it makes it even less easy to talk about, and more prone to people comforting themselves that, oh no, this is not a serious topic. It is a fringe topic. So if I believe that, then I live in a world where no EMF is dangerous, and that's very comforting, because it means, oh, well, I can just buy the next new gadget, and everyone is so excited about these things these days. So that's really my story, and how I guess I was shocked enough for to spend 8 years on the topic and counting.
Wow, that's an amazing story. And something that I gathered from that it was just something that you mentioned in the last minute, was regarding how there is no natural alternative to a product for EMFs. Like, for example, we have, except for nature, right? So we just completely avoid it and we just go live away from all this, right? But it's interesting because you were talking about our water contamination, and then our protein powders that are contaminated with lead, cadmium, mercury. There's so many different things that, okay, we learn about that. We can filter our water. We can buy third-party tested products to ensure that we aren't getting those heavy metals or other things, or eat organic produce so that we're not getting exposed to pesticides. But because EMFs are just these products and this technology is so a part of our daily routine, it's just become normalized. So it's reducing our exposure to that is almost like going against the norm of what everyone is used to. So I think that's what's so powerful about how you are speaking to this subject and providing more awareness around it in your book, The Non-Tinfoil Guide to EMFs. Amazing book. For those listening, if no one's read this book, They should read it because it's really an easy, like, to dissect, just an easy read. It's very funny. Like, I love like the jokes that you put in there, and it's just easy to kind of understand, okay, so this is what I should probably be avoiding in my home. Here's what I can do to maybe mitigate my exposure to it. So, kind of going off of that, in your book, you mentioned that if we were to hire an EMF mitigation expert, there are 4 different types of measures that they can use to reduce, or things that they want to look for in the homes to help reduce. So could you maybe dive into those then? Because we think of EMFs as a whole, but it really kind of, we break it down into 4 different subparts. So I'd love to hear what those are, and then maybe some examples of them.
For sure. It's like other topics. If you start looking into words like toxins, like, people want to avoid toxins. In reality, if you open up the word toxin and it's a box, there's a bunch of things in there. There's the heavy metals, the plastics, and this and that. So it is a complicated world to try to unpack. But for EMFs, there are a few categories of different exposures that we get. One of them that most people will hear me talk about, because it is still, to this day, is the fastest growing, and it's also a great way to get people into this world, is wireless radiation. That's one type, right? And that's in a certain set of frequencies. This includes like Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and smartphones, and also cell towers. So these are exposures, we could call them radio frequency radiation. And that's really everything that communicates in between each other. So that's one category. And in the average home, you would find multiple sources of that, whether it's people's cell phones that they keep near their bedstand, or even, nowadays you have video game consoles. You're going to have your Apple TV or Roku and Media Center. Most things that you purchase that are electronics nowadays, even appliances, are now Bluetooth. So I would say most electronics appliances that you purchase nowadays would have some sort of wireless signal on it. And it's getting worse, because some people say, well, why not automate my entire home with sensors, and every bulb's going to be connected to my phone. Every control I can have over the airflow in my home, or all of these are going to be Bluetooth. So of course you're adding more and more of the same problem. So that's wireless radiation right there. You also have other types of exposures that a lot of people are surprised about because they're so ubiquitous that we don't think about them. One of them is simply the fact that we're exposed to electricity. And that comes as a surprise, because a lot of people, including myself, not so many years ago, I really thought that the electricity in our homes runs in wires. Right? It is inside the wire. So how could I be exposed to electricity? But in reality, there's a fraction of the electricity that stays inside the wire, which is most, or else we would all be, walking around getting electric shocks. But there's a large field, an electric field that irradiates from wires that are unshielded. And that's most wires in your home that are plastic Romex wires, they're called. So that's an electric field. So what can you do about those? Well, it's a matter of not sleeping right next to very powerful things that are plugged into the grid. There are ways to minimize that. And what people experience when they start reducing their exposure to electric fields is just a sense of calm, because you might be surprised, but some people have 1 to 3 volts running through their body at all times, which is the equivalent of getting, a little battery shock on your body. You don't feel it, but it is certainly not something we need more of. There's this entire thing, electromedicine and using microcurrent and all of these things. They might have benefits. In fact, I've explored these modalities, and I believe a lot that some of the use of human-made EMFs for therapy are very promising, but they are used for a set amount of time. It's a specific frequency, and it's a specific intensity. So there's a reason that we use these frequencies and these intensities, and they've been developed by researchers and doctors. And it's nothing like exposing myself to, electricity that is leaking from my laptop and going onto my body in a random fashion over a lifetime, 12 hours per day. So these are exposures that are really more like pollution and less like a therapeutic signal. So another said of that, there's electric fields that irradiates, and will kind of jump onto your body because we are, a big bag of water. So we do attract electricity. And there's also magnetic fields. A magnetic field, each EMF has an electric component and a magnetic component. The magnetic component at these frequencies of household electricity, which is 50 to 60 hertz. 50 hertz is Europe and, Australia, and 60 hertz is North America, more or less. And the magnetic field is more static in the sense that it is around a motor that is running. For example, imagine a common problem with magnetic fields might be you have an air filter or a fan because it's too hot in your room, but you keep it very close to your pillow, like you have a fan blowing right in your face. Well, around a fan can be quite powerful and draw a lot of power from the wall, and it can create this magnetic field in there. Another problem with magnetic fields was the controversy in the 90s and early 2000s around the fact that people, especially young children that live too close to high voltage power lines, are exposed to a magnetic field. The high voltage power lines can be very, very tall. I cannot recall, is it 75, 100 feet tall? And the electricity does not stay in the wires, just like it doesn't stay in the wire in your walls. Now we're talking about a massive amount of electricity. So it creates a sort of bubble that can sometimes, the impacts of that or the measurements that you can take make you realize that the magnetic field is literally, almost a kilometer wide on, and half of them on both sides. So living too close to that is kind of a low-level biological stress that was linked and still linked to this date with an increase in childhood leukemia. So it's not that everyone is sick living in these fields, but it is a sort of environmental toxin that if you live in it, it makes it probably more difficult for your body to recover. And if you have certain children that were already exposed by other things, maybe that's why they're unable to recover, or this exposure puts them over the edge. And the last type that I'll talk about is a type of electric field, but it's called dirty electricity. The more engineering or scientifically precise term is high frequency voltage transients, but a lot of people will start feeling dizzy at this point of the conversation. So basically it is the quality of the electricity running into your walls. So imagine that instead of thinking about what is the quality of the water running in the pipes that I cannot see throughout my home, now think about what is the quality of the electricity running throughout your home. And by quality, I mean how polluted is it by different frequencies. And that's a widely, it's a very charged topic and a little bit complicated to think about. But basically, the more frequencies are running on your wires, the more likely the electricity in your home is stressful to your biology. It's not that complicated. It's another type of pollution. And there are there's not enough studies around dirty electricity, but a few researchers have said, we think this is impacting blood sugar regulation. And there are indications that people with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes were more able to control their insulin levels or blood sugar when they filtered out the dirty electricity. There's also links in the science with ADD, ADHD symptoms, where children seem to be more agitated in this space, which is, again, just something that literally affects your nervous system. And then there are doctors who told me that there are patients who have a very poor ability to control their nervous system. For example, people with Parkinson's fare way better with low dirty electricity. Again, if your nervous system is already prone to any sort of stimuli and you have a hard time controlling it, whether it's, the link between your brain and nervous system, and you have poor motor skills, if you're in an area of high dirty electricity, it's not that much of a stretch to think that it's just making that ability even poorer and is just preventing you from fully feeling, your best.
Yeah, thank you for explaining all that. And that's just That's just crazy, the amount of things that we can get exposed to, like even just like in our own home. And so, um, a lot of the people are going to be listening to this, I would imagine, just after just that explanation, even if they didn't listen to the rest of the podcast, would be like, okay, I need to talk to somebody, like, let's measure what's going on in the home, because that was enough information to be like, wow, there is a lot we can be getting exposed to that could be negatively impacting our health. And I do want to dive into symptoms soon, but I'd love to just start with talking about how can somebody go about maybe hiring an EMF mitigation expert? Is there certain qualifications they should look for? And then I'm assuming that these individuals have the tools to be able to measure these different things that you are talking about, in terms of like even like what you were talking about, like the frequency that's coming from the wires behind the walls that we don't see, but that can be affecting people too. So
100%. It can feel overwhelming just looking at these 4 types of EMFs. Each can be measured using different types of equipment. So it's really, to this day, I've spent 8 years doing this. I do own these EMF meters, but the cheaper ones, consumer grades, but I don't improvise myself as an EMF mitigation specialist, because it is really something that you need to do as your full-time job to get good at it. You can hire these professionals. They're going to cost, a few $100s, just like, a mold specialist would cost around the same thing, or maybe someone who analyzes the air quality in your home. But some people have multiple qualifications where they can not only look at EMFs, but they can also do mold and also do other things. One of the main profession is called building biology. So if you go to just type in, in a search bar, building biology, and then your city, you're going to find someone. At least in North America, they're more prevalent. Around the world, it depends on where you live. We definitely need, hundreds of thousands of these professionals around the world, and they're so needed. But some building biologists have taken the necessary training to be able to look at even water quality, mold, air quality, the presence or absence of radon, and other things that also matter, right? EMFs is not the only thing that could make it that people don't feel well in their home, but sometimes, if you want to just rule out certain things, if you say, well, I don't know, my kids are getting sick all the time, is there mold? I think all of these things are great to look at. Unfortunately, if you hire a mold specialist or someone for air quality, there's very little chance they will look at EMFs, right? So it's a particular set of skills and understanding that they need to have. There's also my colleague, Brian Hoyer, who has his own company, Shielded Healing. He has a team that operates all around the U.S., and he's not a building biologist per training. He's been trained in Europe by other types of skill sets, but in the end, he's also extremely, extremely competent. And he also looks at the quality of light that you install in your home, which is, we could open this and talk about it for 10 hours, but, it all of it matters. In the end, it's just quite simply how compatible with good health is your home, your environment, right? This is part of this subset of medicine that I've grown fond of, which is called environmental medicine. Looking at the environment almost first to when it comes to people's health.
Yes, I appreciate the reference, and then I appreciate you kind of bringing it back to, this podcast interview is all about EMFs, but again, it really does matter to look at the whole picture, right?
For sure.
About our water quality, products, mold, all the air quality, all those different things. I really appreciate you mentioning that. And something I was absolutely astounded to learn from your book was that you had mentioned that since the 1960s, it's estimated that EMF radiation from man-made sources is now estimated at 10 billion times higher, which can explain why maybe more people might be becoming sensitive. So I'm curious, what are some of the biggest symptoms that you have been able to associate, maybe through research and through talking with individuals, and maybe even yourself included, to EMFs?
Yeah, and I have to correct this because I learned that after writing my book. It's actually much worse than that. It's the real figure that some people use. At least in some regards, it's not exactly precise. It's more like a billion times a billion. So it's a quintillion times increase compared to ancestral background levels if we talk about 1 gigahertz, which is, almost the average cell phone out there. So that's the increase compared to 4 generations ago. So it doesn't mean anything, but it means that there's something new in the environment. So a lot of people who are skeptical of this entire topic might say things like, well, sunshine exposes us to very intense EMF radiation that our biology is completely compatible with. We can handle sunshine at least for, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes before burning our skin. So how come, cell phone radiation that doesn't burn my skin could damage me? And in reality, it's just that the frequency and the signal characteristics of these exposures are brand new. In nature, you didn't have a lot of microwave radiation or radio frequency radiation in the environment, and that's why we've used it for telecommunications. There's no interference, right? It's a band that in biology is wide open. The only radio frequency radiation we get is from space, from distant stars, and these are levels a quintillion times lower than the average electro-polluted city out there. So of course, our biology is not accustomed to having that much noise in these frequency bands, and we're starting to discover why. In 2021, engineers for the first time have determined in a scientific study that certain sets of biofilms that are colonies of bacteria in your body, could be in your colon, could be on your skin, could be anywhere, communicate with each other using radio frequency radiation. And it's a bit hard to believe. Someone asked me, well, does it mean, they have a miniature cell phone? It's not like that. It's that they emit signals, and it could be, thermal signal, which would be a type of invisible light that we wouldn't see, like infrared. It could be other types of light, but it could also be, if you go down in the EMF spectrum, it could also be a sort of communication. I don't know what they tell each other. It's probably very basic, but what is the role of that communication to your health, your immunity, and the health of your microbiome? The point is, we don't even know. That's the thing. That's the first time we detected that certain beneficial bacteria communicate with each other using this signal. So of course, what could go wrong, right? If you introduce external noise, that is your cell phone, or you're typing away on your phone and saying, "Oh, that's funny. Someone sent me a cat video." Well, what is it doing to these bacteria, right, that are receiving this signal and saying, what is that, right? They're only perceiving noise. So it's a noise that is probably not compatible with our biology. And that's why, diving into symptoms, all sorts of people have all sorts of reactions. It could really be anything, because EMFs can impact any cell in the body. So for some people, it's very clear they will get a headache when talking on the phone, which is, to me, a sign of brain inflammation or something that is happening quite acutely. And in a sense, they're almost lucky, because they can sense right away that there's something wrong. So they're not likely to put it on their head. Some other people are not so lucky, and they don't feel a headache, and they will talk again and again for hours on their phone, exposing themselves to potential risks related to brain health or brain tumors. So it's not necessarily better that you don't feel anything. But other people have reported just having poor sleep and not being able to really find anything that's the root cause of their sleep. And a lot of people realize, when I turn off my phone, I turn off the Wi-Fi in the entire household, and I do all these action steps that I talk about, in the summits and the book, I just feel like I sleep more soundly. There are some scientific studies on that, where the researchers were really baffled when they realized that such a low level of radiation could impact brain waves. Well, it looks like our brain can pick up the environment and is very, very sensitive. In fact, if you look at what is the intensity of a neuron talking to another neuron, it's very, very small. It's infinitely small compared to your cell phone. So it's not that surprising, even on an engineering standpoint, that when you add external electricity in the form of cell phone radiation, or, I don't know, AirPods, or anything that is quite close to your brain, there's interference between what your brain is trying to do during the night, which is, a specific schedule based on your circadian rhythm and habits around food and around the light environment and all sorts of signals that tell you, okay, well, I think at 9 p.m., I'm going to start releasing melatonin, and then I'm going to start yawning and go to bed at 10. And then I have these cycles I have to go through. Deep sleep, REM, light sleep, and we're going to go through all of this, and then we're going to wake up at our usual time. So there's all sorts of things that your body is trying to do at night, including, of course, healing and trying to recover from everyday stressors. And if you add an external signal, well, now there's a wild card in the mix, and a lot of people realize that it can negatively impact their sleep. So they don't see the benefits unless they remove the agent, and then they realize I sleep more soundly. For a lot of people, what makes it real for them is that if they turn off their phone and Wi-Fi and they don't tell anyone else, they don't even tell their spouse, and all of a sudden they realize, well, he's sleeping more soundly, or she's sleeping more soundly, or my kids are sleeping more soundly, or you're dreaming more, things like that are signs of better quality sleep. So I would say these are symptoms that are kind of everyday symptoms. They're not necessarily alarming, but of course it just shows you that when you minimize EMFs in your household, there's room for improvement. There's all sorts of untapped potential that you can attain if you have a cleaner environment.
And going off of that with, reducing, our exposure to these things, like especially at night while we're sleeping, like I feel like this might be a good way to interject baby monitors, because a lot of people are using those and babies can't necessarily tell us like, oh, like I slept better or I didn't sleep better. Yeah. Or, I mean, we could probably tell by their symptoms, but again, too, you do mention that in your book, and I'd love to elaborate on that, because I think that's something a lot of people don't think about, like when we're kind of discussing EMFs, because everyone's using a baby monitor. So can you kind of elaborate a little bit on that topic?
For sure. A baby monitor emits essentially the same radiation as a Wi-Fi router at 2.4 gigahertz or a Bluetooth anything. And I mean, there's Bluetooth diapers nowadays. So if we talk about baby monitors, we have to talk about any source of wireless radiation, and there are long-term implications of keeping them close to the kid. But the short-term are, what if the thing you're trying to use to monitor your kid's sleep is the reason they don't sleep, or is one of the reasons they sleep poorly, right? That's kind of ironic. And yet a lot of people are starting to track their sleep or their kids' sleep using wireless radiation. So I did use a baby monitor sparingly when my kid was younger. Now he's 6, almost 7 next month. So obviously it's been several years. It's been, I don't donated it to another family or something like that, but I kept it far away from the kid, right? Distance really, really matters. And I was surprised because, of course, the first thought is, okay, will I hear if Elliot is, screaming in the middle of the night, and let's say we're at relatives and we're, having a barbecue party in the yard, and it's so far from the bedroom, there's no way I'll be able to hear the kiddo. And yet at 10 to 15 feet, it still picks up the signal just fine. So a lot of them have a level of sensitivity that is quite good. So you don't have to put it in the crib. And most organizations would recommend against that for choking hazards anyway. But a lot of parents, I see how they would place it, and it would be very close to the kid, just in case, right? I want to make sure it picks up the sound. For me, it was in a corner of the room, like really, literally like the furthest away you can place it. The same goes for, anything wireless you want to have in your room. A lot of people have, as adults, their alarm clock by their bedstand and in the form of their phone. And they don't want to put it on airplane mode. If they don't want to put it on airplane mode, I understand, because, for some reason they want to be reachable. Sometimes it's by young, older kids in the teenage years, and I can respect that, but set it as far away from your pillow as possible. That's really, the distance really, really matters, because the intensity of the signal will drop off exponentially as you create distance. So for example, if you have if you use a cell phone to your ear, you have 100% of the radiation. As an example, at 1 foot, you already have a drop off of 80% of the problem. At 2 feet, it's 90. And then if we talk about 15 feet, it's probably 99.9% of a reduction of intensity. Doesn't make the exposure completely safe, but it makes it tremendously safer. So it goes for any sort of wireless device by the pillow, including, of course, baby monitors.
Amazing tips. Distance matters. Absolutely. So I would love to kind of talk a little bit more. I want to talk later on. I really want to dive into like what people can kind of do like just after this conversation, like great takeaways. And that was an amazing takeaway. Just distance matters. I love that. But something that really intrigued me in your book was talking about how EMFs can really impact us at that cellular level, affecting like calcium gated voltage channels, affecting our like opening up our barriers to toxic invaders. And so I think that's a big thing that I'd love to kind of just dive into, and maybe some of the downstream effects of that, because, oftentimes too, with the people that I work with, it's not just one thing that I'm seeing. Like it's not just mold, or it's not just EMFs, or not just this, which brings it back to that whole environmental piece. It's like, there could be something that potentially opened up your body to become a little bit more vulnerable to being susceptible to an environmental toxin or toxins. And so I liked how you were talking about that with EMFs in your book. So I'd love to have you just elaborate a little bit on that part.
For sure. The most credible science we have around how is it that a very low level signal could be hurting us. It's not true. A lot of, the safety standards are based on heating effects. So basically, if your body overheats, we know that it can do thermal damage, including, sometimes thermal damage, people think about a burn. It's not like that. It's just if you increase the temperature of tissues, you might cause issues. That rhymed somehow. It was very funny. It was like, what a nice catchphrase right there. But basically, one of the problems that has been identified related to thermal damage is if you have a phone in the pocket as a man and you have a change in if you overheat testicles, you're going to have a change in fertility. But we're not talking about the thermal damage, because even if you don't have a heating effect, the tissues are not getting overheated, we know that there are other things going on. And these are called simply the non-thermal effects. And they include, for example, oxidative stress. And we know that oxidative stress, the research in anti-aging is very clear. It's probably one of the root causes of aging in general. So the more oxidative stress you have, the more you have to somehow combat that with your internal antioxidants like glutathione, SOD, catalase, and these are produced internally, but they take up resources. So you can also, of course, have supplemental glutathione. I have it because my doc told me to take it. And I think that nowadays we are getting bombarded with so many toxins that a lot of people have a hard time with detoxification, and they have low levels of glutathione to be started with. So is it because of EMFs? Is it because of other environmental toxins? We don't know. All we know is the endpoint. We don't know what happened before, and we know that there's a big question mark around why is it so difficult nowadays to stay healthy? We know that there are so many toxins in the environment, but EMFs is one of them that is overlooked, and yet the mechanisms of damage are very similar compared to a lot of environmental toxins. So we have, in the book, I talk about the work of Dr. Martin Pall, but there's other people that looked at the biophysics of EMFs, and it's oxidative stress that sometimes can cause DNA damage that needs to be repaired, and in the end is just over time sapping your resources. So you see a reduction of cellular energy, a reduction of mitochondrial productivity or production, and you see an increase in oxidative damage on all levels. So what can this do long term? Well, there's a link with your ability to fight cancer, or do apoptosis and kill cancer cells or cells that are becoming cancerous in your body, which is an ongoing process. So cellular repair. And then, of course, it can have downstream consequences on, we talked about sleep. There's the melatonin hormone that can be affected, but also hormonal health in general. So there's very, very good research about just men that are keeping a cell phone in their pocket. And, I was listening to Dr. Andrew Huberman, neuroscientist, very popular online, and he's used to be skeptical of the entire topic, and yet when he reviewed the topic, he said, geez, the data on the cell phone in the pocket causing a reduction in fertility and testosterone, in his view, is even more convincing than the data on BPA, right? In a sense that your phone, it's hard to think about it this way because this is not a chemical. This is not a molecule that you ingest by mistake because you've microwaved your stuffer's dinner or Michelinas or something like that, and now you have a bunch of BPA in there. Or maybe you drank from a plastic bottle that sat in your car for 4 days. That's not it. It's just the fact that the signal from your phone in your pocket is interfering with the normal functioning of your reproductive organs. It goes for both men and women, although we have more research for men. So the research is clear that if you have a phone in your pocket, it's not you're going to be infertile or anything like that, but there's a strong correlation with a reduction in fertility in a world where a lot of men are struggling with proper, sperm quality and count, and a lot of even healthy couples have a hard time conceiving, and they don't know who's the problem. Sometimes it's both partners, but so it is an endocrine disruptor. You might hear this about PFAS and BPAs and plastics and things found in your cosmetics, but in the end your cell phone is also an endocrine disruptor, and that's not something we hear about often enough, and that's really, these are all the downstream consequences. In the end, when people are confused about all these different lines of research, I tell them your phone emits stress, a stressful signal. It is noise to your biology. Your biology is attuned to EMF signals from the environment. If you give your biology sunshine, it loves you to some extent. You don't want to burn your skin. If you give your biology natural foods, you're giving molecules that in the end also came from sunshine, if you think about it. But it becomes very deep, right? So these are all natural things that are compatible with our biology. If you give it more noise, in the form of a very bizarre molecule that is, this transformed type of lead, and then you have it in your protein powder and you gulp it, and your body is like, what are you giving me exactly? Like, I'm gonna take your protein, I'm gonna take this and that and your vitamins, but that type of lead is gonna be super tough for me to go through the liver, try to modify that molecule to excrete it. Very tough, and sometimes it has to even store it in your body instead. I'm dealing with that nowadays, and that I won't even go in that rabbit hole, but I've realized that I have a ton of it. I'm like, what? How's it? So the body is not necessarily able to eliminate all of these. If you add more confusion and more noise to your biology in the form of a cell phone, and then you add Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and cell towers, and you add all these exposures in a random manner, which is for most people 24/7, I'm gonna have all the exposures, then you make it just more difficult for biology to function normally. That's as simple as I can put it. This is a stressor, and it also will inform what can you do about it, right? Because I mean, is it good if I turn off my Wi-Fi? Yes. Is it good if I, instead of speaking on my phone for an hour, I'll do it for 10 minutes? Yes, because any reduction in this stress will be beneficial in your life.
And our body it really has like you've been kind of, you keep going back to talking about, is that our body just has this natural biology, natural ability to detox and support us on a regular basis. Like, we have these amazing detox organs like our liver and kidneys and skin and our lungs and our gut and lymphatic system and everything. And so And you talk about how the EMS, like you've been talking about now, how they really just basically just create that noise, add more noise, confuse our body, adding to that toxic load. And you do kind of break it down in the book, talking about how it can affect each of these different detox organs specifically. But I'd really kind of like to hone in a little bit more on the gut, because I was really, really interested to read about how it can really have such an influence on our gut health and our good gut bacteria. So can you maybe dive a little bit into that piece?
Yeah, we just like many other lines of research. This is one that I keep thinking about. I think every other week I'll just have a thought like, oh, I haven't seen anything published on, what could it be doing to our gut, and that's really the issue with EMFs, is that a lot of lines of research have been abandoned, or we have some indication that something is happening, and then there's not another researcher that will continue furthering the science until we know what on earth does this mean for health. So, for example, we know that cell phone radiation or Wi-Fi and Bluetooth can open barriers in the body. We know that because that's not, new by that's not new at all, because Alan Frey in, I think it was 1971, was doing the studies on rats and found that this radio frequency radiation, sometimes at high levels, but sometimes at lower levels, can open up the blood-brain barrier of rats. So it was, the animal models, but it has also been measured in human beings. What does that mean, blood-brain barrier? Well, your brain is protected by a very, very thin layer of cells. If I recall correctly, what I read is 1 cell thick, or even if if it would be 15 cells thick, I would consider that pretty thin. So anyway, the idea is that normally this barrier is sophisticated and is able to not let toxins into the brain, to keep the brain as clean as possible, because your brain needs to be protected at all costs, like your heart and other organs. But if you don't have your brain on board, you can barely do anything. And while letting the toxins out, it lets the good things in, like the vitamins or anything that your body requires. So that's the blood-brain barrier. But there are other barriers throughout the body. There is even the testicular barrier, the ovarian barrier, and there's also the gut barrier. And a lot of people talk about leaky gut. The scientific term being gut permeability, and there's not a lot of studies exploring cell phones to the gut or laptops and gut permeability. And in fact, I'm not aware of a single one. But if it's opening a barrier on the brain, is it opening your barrier in the gut? Probably is. To what extent is this happening? We don't know, because there's also other things in the environment that can open up barriers, such as glyphosate or other toxic chemicals. So, I'm not here to blame a single agent. I'm just saying maybe we should think about it. So a lot of people also realize that when they have EMF exposures, they seem to digest to have a hard time with digestion. It can be simply because it's a stressor. If it keeps you in fight or flight, you're not digesting as well. And that's, the impact it has on your entire nervous system. So it might be the case that if people are stimulated by the screen, by the notification, but also by the radio frequency radiation, their body stays in this fight or flight mode, and they're not able to digest as well. And then what is it doing to the bacteria and to our second brain, which is the gut bacteria that we have? We don't know. The impact that, for example, radio frequency radiation has on soil bacteria, that some of them are quite similar to certain bacteria in the human body. We know that it's acting as a low-level antibiotic in the soil. So is it why so many people have gut issues? I think it's part of the reason why. Certainly, it should be investigated further, but there's this antibiotic effect on good bacteria, making certain bacteria grow faster, and certain bacteria see their growth inhibited. So the opposite, it will grow slower. There's indications that certain strains of mold will grow faster. Certain strains of candida could grow faster. There's also certain pathogens or certain bacteria that are very dangerous for human beings, including certain strains of E. coli and staph that will become more antibiotic resistant when exposed to radiofrequency radiation. So there's research on that also. So just that alone, I shared that on Instagram a few weeks ago, and just as a reminder almost for myself, and just say, geez, if that's the only problem with EMFs, if we eliminate anything else, but we realize that the more Wi-Fi routers we have, the more we have antibiotic resistance, that's a problem big enough for us to change technology. Why? Because some people are entering the hospital now and they say, I've had a car accident, but it's not that bad. I need a few stitches. But they die in the hospital because of an infection that eventually becomes more and more and more resistant to an antibiotics. So in fact, antibiotic resistance has been identified by, all the World Health Organization of this world, and every government, essentially everyone agrees, and that's rare these days, like everyone agrees on something, that antibiotic resistance is a big problem, because if all of a sudden we don't have antibiotics, it means that certain very simple wounds or infections could kill people, bringing us back in a time where a lot of people were dying from infections that nowadays are, very easy to treat with penicillin and other antibiotics. So that's a lot of speculation, but it is concerning because, what is this black box of health? Well, right now it's really hard to tell which of all these environmental toxicants is the worst. And everyone in their niche, like I could say, guys, forget about everything else. It's just EMFs. This is the sole reason that you have gut dysbiosis and this and that. No, I think this is too reductionist, and a lot of people fall into that. If I was the pesticide guy, maybe I would say, no, it's pesticides. It's definitely pesticides. I think it's a mix of everything. And we have scientific studies that tell you that this is the case. There's a toxic synergy between EMFs and other environmental toxins. For example, in animal studies, we know that certain doses that do not seem to induce toxicity in rats of lead or cadmium or other heavy metals, if you combine that same dose with cell phone radiation, then you get an effect that is toxic, or you get an effect that can be measured in the rat, like oxidative stress or a reduction of antioxidants and things like that can be measured in animals. So we know that certain agents will multiply each other, and it probably goes with mold plus pesticides plus, but also EMFs. So all that to say, I know this is a lot, but all that to say, if you reduce EMFs, you're more likely to have an easier time in life in general, and just be able to recover from anything. So there's only benefits to minimizing exposure, really.
I love that you brought up the part about talking about mold colonization, certain candida, fungal overgrowth, like how in the link between EMFs and that, and then talking about the antibiotic resistant, like certain types of certain things that might become like very hard to treat due to that reason, and the link with EMFs. And it was just interesting. I was talking with Dr. Neil Nathan a few weeks ago on my podcast, who's a renowned like mold expert, and we were talking about how certain types of mold have just become more strong and more. And there's reasons for that, right? Like as things have evolved, and in terms of like what other environmental toxins are in its environment to where it feels like it needs to compete and produce like more mycotoxins and become more like, because it's feeling threatened. And it's all so interesting to me. And how we were talking about how in certain cases, like we need stronger supports to be able to help certain individuals that are exposed to those kinds, because of that reason of them being of that mold toxicity patient being harder to treat because of maybe what they were exposed to, how strong are those strains, and just talking about the link of EMFs potentially being a piece of that, right? is like so important. And I love that we're shedding light on that. And another part I wanted to talk about in your book was you were talking again about like EMFs and invaders. So you do touch on the mold toxicity piece, but you also brought up Epstein-Barr virus and how that can become reactivated in a lot of people. And so that's very interesting to me as well, is just the kind of like, again, we're seeing this link. It's like, okay, like it's not just one thing, but this could be influencing this and this could be influencing that. And we're reducing our total toxic burden, and working on that piece can make things maybe easier to treat. Maybe we become less exposed to things, less of this burden on our detox organs and our cells, and reducing oxidative stress, and our ability to detox becomes heightened. And so all these things can really play such a big part. But it's so interesting, this part about EMFs affecting all of this. You just don't hear a lot of people talking about that. And that's where it's like that unknown toxin that not many people think about, just because, again, like I said earlier in the conversation, it's the norm. So it's like, we don't think about our cell phones as being an endocrine disruptor. So, just super interesting about that connection between EMFs and all these different things we've been talking about so far.
100%. And it really affects everything. That's kind of the dramatic thing about it. But again, I do have to mention, and hopefully people got that and didn't run away yet from the conversation, but you can, like, even if you have all these exposures, many that you're not, you're not in control of, for example, your neighbor's Wi-Fi. Oh, no, that neighbor, and see that cell tower over there, it's super scary. All these things you cannot control, and yet there's a ton you can control. Just like I cannot control the fact that in Montreal, we've had many days in the last years where, what was it, last summer, if I recall correctly, for one day, Montreal was celebrated for being the most polluted air in the world. And I was like, wait a minute, what? Isn't it, some city in India or China? No, it's here because of forest fires and this and that. And what can you do about it? Well, okay, you can wear a mask outside or something, but in the end, it's very tough. Like, I won't change the air quality outside, but I can, filter out the air inside, and I can take precautions. And so it's really a message of control what you can control when it comes to EMS, and that's a lot.
Yes, and I'm glad we're diving into this part because, we talked a lot about like the effects and what we're getting exposed to, but there's a lot that you're saying that we can control. And I love to always bring it back to that point with anything, because we can control a lot. And that's a really comforting thought. So you talk about creating kind of like a low EMF haven, like in our home in the book, because, we have to present the research on what it can be doing to affect us, but then what we can do about it. So what are some of maybe like the heavy hitters or the biggest tips that you can like give to people right now that they could be like, oh yes, I could go turn my Wi-Fi off at night. That's easy. I got that. Like, what are some things that people can do that would make a pretty profound impact on their health?
Yeah, and the impacts are cumulative. So if you think about it means that the more you use a device, or the devices that you use the most matter the most. That's what I would say. If there's, I always talk about the book and kind of have this funny example of what, I don't know if that's a mistake, but I would have explained it differently if I had to write it again. And hopefully I'll have time in the next few years to come up with the second book that I've been itching to write for so many years now. But all that to say that, in the book, I talk about, okay, what is the EMF dose of, your Vitamix blender? It doesn't matter that much in the end, because the Vitamix blender you would be using for a few seconds, it's super fast and you don't stay right next to it. It's so noisy. You might start your shake or soup or something and then go away anyway, which doesn't expose you to a lot because you're creating distance. So don't worry about the Vitamix, or, don't worry about your Bluetooth toaster. Like, some people have emailed me, oh, should I worry about my Bluetooth toaster? Well, how much time do you spend staring at your toast in the morning? A minute, 2 minutes? Like, it's not a huge exposure compared to your phone, laptop, anything in your bedroom. So normally I start even just with that safe haven you talked about in the bedroom. There shouldn't be anything emitting wireless radiation if possible. If they are emitting EMF radiation, put them in the next room or put your phone as far away from your pillow as possible. Or if you keep your phone on airplane mode and you don't need to be reachable at night, that's an option. For us, both phones are on airplane mode. This laptop in front of me will be closed, and anyway, it's on a wire. It's on an Ethernet cable rather than wireless. So that's also an option you can have for all your devices. And at a minimum, turn off the Wi-Fi at night. What I did when my wife was pregnant is that we had these very fun discussions around my work, of course, as the EMF guy. And I said, Jan, I think we should turn off Wi-Fi permanently. She was like, what are you talking about now? But in the end, we ran cables in the home, and it can be done through the walls if you hire, an IT company. And now we have a wire going to this computer. We have a wire going to hers in her office. We have another wire by the sofa so she can connect on her phone. And in fact, it's very practical for her because if she's uploading large videos on Instagram and, she's also an entrepreneur, it's very fast, it's very reliable. And while she's doing it, she's not exposing herself to nothing, right? It's through an Ethernet cable, and you have a converter between the port that your phone uses and Ethernet. So Ethernet to USB-C converter for her iPhone 15 and above. And for that, I don't even know what model this is. I don't even, it shows that I'm not a big fan of, even though I have an iPhone, this one is, I think, 13. So it's a Lightning port to Ethernet. So if you tackle these sources first, the ones that you use every day for hours on end, then you're starting to sometimes eliminate the bulk of your exposure or greatly reduce it, right? So if you are someone who talks on the phone a lot, then there's a lot of opportunity for you to avoid putting the phone to your face, right? And my dad would fall in that category. He's a realtor, he's been doing it for 25, 26 years at this point. He's on the phone a lot, and sometimes I see him using speakerphone, which is better, but using, wired solutions on your phone is preferable to make sure you don't annoy people around you. But, the goal is just looking at the everyday devices that you use and trying to minimize exposure.
We actually, a few years ago, we hardwired everything in our house. Like we have an Ethernet cable also running to every computer and TV and everything. And it really wasn't that hard to do. And it sounded like it was very, stressful and, but, we just tackled it one day and we were like, oh, we feel better now. Like, just like it wasn't that big of a deal. And, it's so nice to know because, for myself as well, like I work with clients every day. Like I'm on the computer a lot working with people, and that has made a huge difference for me. Like being able to just, like, I can tell it with my energy and, and just how I feel daily that I'm not getting exposed to as much as like I would have been getting exposed to if I was on Wi-Fi or anything. So, these things really can make a difference. And you do layer that in the book and like things that you can do, which I love, like those, like, those tasks that people can like just accomplish. Like maybe one of it's just like turning your cell phone off at night or, keeping it outside the room, turning the Wi-Fi off. Like those are amazing tips. And one thing I want to ask, because I get this question quite a lot, is microwaves. So what is your take on microwaves? Like, is it just about like the distance again, like you were talking about the Vitamix, like standing near it, or again, to affecting the quality of our food? Like what do you, what's your take on that?
I don't use a microwave. I think that eating microwave foods over and over again. First, we know now the research is very, very clear, and I'm happy that more people are talking about it. But if you use a microwave and you have any sort of plastic in there, even if it kind of looks like a carton thing, and I don't think there's plastic in there. You can bet there's plastic. There's plastic everywhere. So if I had to microwave something, I would put it out of the tray and never use any sort of plastic, because we know it will greatly leach on your food. So you make the problem much worse if you microwave anything. And yet companies continue saying things like, oh, take this plastic bag with a bunch of broccoli florets in there and put it in the microwave with the bag, and then you hit it for 2 minutes, and of course the more heat you have, the more plastic leaching you have. So that's one thing. Second thing I would say on an EMF standpoint, again, if you don't use the microwave a lot and it's there, well, you don't feel like you have to toss it or anything, but don't keep your face right next to it while it's cooking stuff. The microwave can emit the equivalent of multiple cell phones, but it would be for a short duration, of course, but staring at the popcorn while it's cooking is not ideal. I wouldn't do that. And then in general, I don't know if I'm too snob or too much of a foodie, but I don't know. I just don't like the idea of microwave foods anymore. And now it's been so many years, we don't even own one. I want, to keep that space in my kitchen for something else because I have way too many things, a Vitamix and, air fryer and this and that. And our pantry is full of different things. Like I'm the home cook on top of that. So for me, a microwave is just, something where I would tend to store things in the microwave. So instead, I just get rid of it. So I don't have a use for it. Some people would say, well, microwaving food and heating food that way can change the properties of your food, or I don't know exactly. I haven't looked into it too deeply, but I would tend to be to discourage eating only microwave foods, for example, or a lot of it, just out of prudence, because of course, heating something with infrared with heat is different than blasting it with microwaves. And that's just, my kind of skepticism towards newer technologies. Even if it's an old technology, it's not that old compared to, our biology that doesn't have time to evolve with all these changes in the environment. So I would be prudent towards it. And that's it. If you want to use it occasionally, I will not shame you for it.
What about there's so many companies out there regarding like EMF blocking devices or utilizing like scalar energy, which is supposed to help kind of provide this like protective coating, if you will, to like almost in a sense blocking, but protecting your cells from the energy that the EMFs can be emitting. So you don't have to mention obviously any company names, but what's your take on EMF blocking devices? I mean, distance seems to be a huge thing, and just reducing your exposure in general is like the biggest thing you want to do. But what about blocking?
Well, you mentioned it perfectly. If you start with the thought that first you should minimize time of use, create distance, and if you have something Bluetooth and you have no use for it, switch it for something non-Bluetooth. So it's just an overall framework we have to use, or else we can become lazy and look for a magic bullet. And in the last 8 years, I have still not endorsed a single thing that claims to this entire category that claims to harmonize EMFs and say, well, if you put that on your phone, you stick it on your phone, now your phone is safe. I haven't met one scientist or one doctor that would say, oh, that's completely accurate and now the phone is safe. What they find sometimes is that people who used to get headaches don't anymore, which is a benefit. So I think it's playing more helping the body cope with exposures, which is not necessarily a bad thing if you understand that your role in this is not to install some magic thing on everything in your home and then blast yourself with as many EMFs as possible. If you're doing that, I think you're doing it wrong. It's like saying, well, now that I'm taking glutathione 10 times a day, I can have all these heavy metals in my water because look, I'm detoxing super fast. Well, no. I mean, you would probably be better off with glutathione in a reasonable dose and not having the heavy metal exposure, because the heavy metal exposure is inherently stressful to your biology. Like the ideal level of heavy metals and of EMFs would be 0. And that's really like, that's really what I'll say about that. There are certain EMF blocking cases that could be useful if you carry your phone and you still want to keep it on. For personally, I use airplane mode. That's simpler for me, but some people have to be on call, and it's a requirement for their job. So there's all sorts of products that can have their use, but I think that how can I put this gently? A lot of the EMF protection space has marketing that is simplistic, and that's a shame because sometimes it uses half truths to get people in, and sometimes you're gonna ask me on Monday, and I think, oh, this is unacceptable. These companies are problematic, and yet sometimes the next day I think, well, at least people now are aware that there's a problem, and it's maybe providing partial protection. So, I even talk to some of these companies sometimes, and I don't have initially anything against them, but for sure, people that are seeking magic bullets are tempted to not do anything about EMFs, just install things on their devices and call it a day. And I hope that people see beyond that, and also take necessary steps to just lower EMFs the best that they can, that they're able to.
The last question I have regarding a product is grounding mats. Do you have an opinion on those? Like, do they, I've heard conflicting theories on them, and if they're really working well, or if they're actually emitting something that is similar to EMFs, but not actually EMFs. I don't know. I've heard conflicting things on it, so I'm going to leave the floor to you on that one.
Yeah. It is conflicting. It depends on what your goal is. The earthing researchers, and one of them is included in my summit, Dr. Gaetan Chevalier. He's adamant that, the more earthing you do, the better you are. That's always true if you do it in nature. So if you are barefoot on the ground, if the ground is moist, it's more effective. So if you're, walking in the sand or desert, you will not get a lot of grounding. If you are swimming in the sea, you will get that, like, the absolute dose of grounding or earthing. And that's really something that can be measured, and it has benefits. And I find that the more I research it, the more I realize they call it, vitamin G for grounding. Exactly. So I find that funny, but in the end, I mean, you could say it's vitamin S for the sun. It's part of nature. Like, we used to have that all the time. Now we don't. And what is it causing in our biology? It's probably, a sort of deficiency of natural frequencies that we are developing. So I think that the research on it is becoming more and more sound. And when you do it in nature, it's for sure safe. Inside, when you use grounding mats and pillows and things like that, I'm a little bit torn, because some people in my community, and a lot of them, are extremely sensitive to changes in the environment. So they have been exposed to large doses of EMFs, and they can feel that something is off in certain situations if they use grounding mats. Some of them have had very good results. Some of them feel like it doesn't work for them. It is hard to navigate. Right now, I would tend to think that these are beneficial almost for everyone, but you have to test it for yourself. I haven't found them to be very easy to use in the bed because of, I don't know, I'll be sweating. Like, it was like a mat you put underneath your sheet, and it wasn't very comfortable with me. But right now, I'm using one at my desk. I have a hard time telling you if it's helping. It's part of so many things I do, but I'd say that I do believe that earthing is extremely beneficial, and that I hope that we can continue furthering the science to make sure that this is, I don't know, eventually we could even have certain places that by default have the floors that are grounded, trying to, again, bring nature in our homes that have been made so artificially.
Yeah, no, and it's amazing, but when it comes to earthing, like, that's just one of the, when I'm working with people and I'm telling them, like, I want to start really regulating their nervous system. Like, I say, one of the easiest things you can do, if weather permits, because not everyone wants to go ground in the snow, but just go ground outside on a patch of grass or a rock or the beach or wherever you can, a trail, wherever it is, because it's amazing. Like, I'm glad that there's more research and more people talking about it. But again, it's just like, it makes sense because it's what our ancestors used to do all the time. And then we're becoming so much more far removed from it. So I'm glad that you brought that up, and thank you for answering that question. And one of the last things I wanted to talk about was I was very interested in your book when you talked about how the Swedish government actually recognizes electromagnetic hypersensitivity as a functional impairment, but that you how is it that they are more attuned to that versus us here in the United States or Canada or North America? I'm just curious on that.
Yeah, and some people would say, even though it's been technically recognized, is it like what happened after? The more I learned about it, the more I realized that even the Swedish government, according to many researchers in electro hypersensitivity, is not doing an extremely good job at it. They used to do a good job, and then eventually a lot of industry stepped in and said, oh, we will not have any accommodations for these people. I feel like the entire field of electro hypersensitivity is exploding because more and more people fall in that category and say, I feel it now. It's not that I feel a headache when I have a phone on my head, is I feel a headache if my neighbor is talking on the phone. Imagine what kind of problem this could create in your life if now all of a sudden it's environmental exposures that are keeping that headache 24/7 or causing tinnitus, for example. So I would say that now things are evolving a little bit, but it's very, very tough because if we have the recognition that certain people are experiencing these symptoms and made sick by the technology, then we have to change things in a major way, right? Because just the cell phone tower, should we turn it off? And then what does it mean for cell phone communications or the inability to the other 10,000 people that were connected to the tower to connect to the internet? It's a tough societal change to tackle, but at a minimum, the researchers are recommending that we should have safe zones with no EMFs that are protected, and we should further the studies around electro hypersensitivity. You have certain leaders in this field like Dr. Dominique Belpom from France, who is starting to be able to help these people. Dr. Neil Nathan that you interviewed is also one of the pioneers because he understands the multiple environmental sensitivities and how they're triggered, and also in some situations how they can be healed. And it's a bit tough to navigate this question because some people that suffer from EMFs have, how can I put it? It is tricky. We have a de facto sensitivity to the signals. These signals are artificial. They are a stressor for anyone, whether you feel it or not. But for some people, they have developed over time, just like someone maybe that started with a gluten intolerance to an allergy, eventually somehow we don't know exactly when it happened, but they developed a celiac disease where they have a breadcrumb and now they can have intestinal bleeding or something completely major happen, and it can be bedridden from a breadcrumb. And we don't laugh at these people who have a breadcrumb by mistake and are bedridden. We try to help them, and we understand celiac disease better. But I feel like we're in a state with electro hypersensitivity where these people can literally be sick from minute exposures, and they are facing a lot of medical gaslighting at the moment. So it means that people are in disbelief, and they are, I wouldn't say the majority of them, but many of them are getting sent to psychiatrists, and the extent of their problem is being downplayed, but the suffering is there. So it is a very, very tricky situation. I would say what changed for me in the last 2 years is that I spoke with a lot of environmental medicine doctors. They come at it through a different angle than some researchers or policymakers around electro hypersensitivity. For these clinicians, it's a question of how can we bring the body into balance. When they see someone getting so sick from what they perceive as a very small EMF exposure, their first reflex is saying, what is happening inside the body? And most of the time what is happening is that EMF is not their only trigger. They have food sensitivities, they have mold, they have heavy metals, they have everything. When they start reducing the body burden, many people who used to consider themselves electro hypersensitive are now better able to cope with these stressors. So I think that overall, my understanding of it is that electro hypersensitivity, sometimes people just seem to come with it and they've always kind of had it, and it might have a genetic factor to it. But a lot of people who develop this electro hypersensitivity develop a sort of low resilience state to something that no one should be exposed to. So, of course, the environment is sick. Of course, it's not like there's something inherently wrong with these people, but there's also a second part to it that can be done in parallel while we get better regulations and better technologies and make things safer, is that we need to help these people medically, because we can improve their body's response to it and just help them survive in this very toxic environment. And also, we can make sure that they do not face, a mental asylum or something crazy like that, because it's happening. I read horror stories every year, and it makes me very sad. And the reality is that a lot of people are fleeing civilization, because if you are sick from your neighbor's Wi-Fi, there's nowhere to run in Montreal, right? You got to live in the woods or somewhere, and then good luck. It's very, very tough. So these are extreme examples, but I'm in communication with some individuals that are these sort of modern refugees from the technology, and yeah, it's a tough topic to tackle. At least if these people get the necessary help that they need, and a zone where there's no human-made EMFs, at least they would be able to live a good life, while we figure things out. And they need help.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's why, the work that you're doing is so important, because you've been, kind of at the forefront of talking about EMFs and the effects that they have on us, and in hosting a lot of these different summits, and just having these talks with people and researchers and environmental medicine doctors, and just putting great minds together to say, okay, like, what can we do to help these people? Like, what, especially those individuals that you were just talking about that are getting so gaslighted, unfortunately, by different medical doctors due to their symptoms, because their symptoms do seem out there, but they're completely true. And I have met these individuals as well. And, it is very sad to hear their stories about, how they've been to different practitioners and they feel like they can't live a normal life because they feel the effects of their neighbor's Wi-Fi or their TV, or they can't walk by, anything really that's emitting like any type of electrical field. And so, it's so important to have these conversations. And so I'm glad that we can kind of end it on that and talk about maybe the summit that is going to be, getting released next week. And can you talk a little bit more about that, how people can sign up, where people can find you, and maybe anything else that you might be working on right now that you want to discuss for the individuals listening?
For sure. So I'm sure you're going to have links, to register to the summit. It's a free event from April 10 to 15. It's called the 2025 EMF Hazard Summit. My goal has been since 2016 to just raise public awareness. And this year we want to do it a little bit differently. We have a focus on the most vulnerable populations. And these are unborn fetuses, children, teenagers, because they absorb more EMFs, and they are the first generation that have been exposed to EMF since day one. And it really makes a difference in how their body will respond, because they still have developing brains and nervous systems. So that's the topic this year. It's called EMF Hazards Safeguard Our Future. And it's an invitation for, young parents, expecting parents, but also grandparents that want to protect the next generation, want to learn these things for themselves, try to protect themselves individually and preach by example, and then have these conversations with the family. And sometimes grandparents will have to have very difficult conversations with their, adult children, not about how to raise their kids. That's not, necessarily the approach that most of them want, but just, hey, have you heard about this topic of EMFs? It looks like it's impacting, kids' sleep. Oh, really? Okay, well, maybe I'll try something. So try to learn this information so you can influence, be a benefit, and be a leader in this field for your entire family, for the next generations. So that's 18 presentations from April 10 to 15. And I hope you join us. That's really I will not mention other projects because I've got plenty to chew on with this project already, and I think it's gonna be amazing. I'm super proud of our team for putting it together for fourth year, and I hope that many people can tune in to watch the free presentations.
Definitely. Well, I will include all the links in the show notes, and I've been also promoting it. And so hopefully we get a lot of people to sign up and just help to spread the word, because when we get more people to listen, they tell other people about it and other people, and then more people get to know. So thank you, Nick, for being a guest. This was so informative, and I'm really excited for people to get to learn all this incredible, important information. So it was such a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thanks again for having me. It's been a nice conversation, and thanks for helping spreading the word.
Yeah, thank you.